Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Thank you for joining me for the podcast where personal stories can have a global impact. My guest today is psychologist Dr. Alan Godwin, the author of the brand new book, Ties That Blind, Unraveling Stories That Keep Us in the Dark. The book was just released on October 21st, 2025. Alan, welcome to the show.
Well, it is a pleasure to be with you this morning, and I'm honored to be here with you.
I'm honored to have you. Thank you for coming on. So, this podcast is a storytelling podcast, and your book is about stories. The stories about who we are, what we've lived through, how we make sense of the people around us. But sometimes those stories don't always tell the truth. They keep us comfortable while keeping us blind. So, tell us
Yeah,
about first of all, your own story of growing up in what you call a collectively deceptive world of Jim Crow, Mississippi.
yeah. As I was formulating the ideas about this book, and I feel like it's a long time coming. This has been over several years. Um, the thing that I work with a lot of individuals in my psychology practice who've been deceived in some personal story. And I tell one of the stories I tell in the book is about an individual who grew up in a very dysfunctional family. And in order to kind of get along in that family, she had to buy into the family story. And what I call that is a family drama. And so it was very much a mama drama. And I would say that my client was experiencing mama drama trauma. That's what caused her to come see me. And as time went by, I'd say starting about 10 years ago, what I started noticing was that the dynamics of that drama arrangement and how people get sucked into dramas and the toll that it takes on them and how they can ultimately extricate themselves from that drama. I started becoming aware of the fact that that's happening collectively. It's not just individuals, but what I was starting to become aware of is that there were masses of people that were buying into a deceptive story and being hoodwinked. And so what that did was it led me to start reading. I probably read five or six dozen different books on authoritarians, demagogues, demagogic systems. And if you look at how that happens collectively, it's really just the collective version of how it happens individually. So I wanted to write about that. And as I got into it, I started realizing I really don't need to write about this from the standpoint of an academic or a clinician because I grew up in a system like that. It was very much of a demagogic system of Jim Crow, Mississippi. And so I started looking at the dynamics of that. It was eye opening for me to see that I had been really spent my whole early part of my life wrapped up in a story that sounded true, but it was false.
Hmm.
And it was this story about racial hierarchy that we all accepted as being true, but it wasn't until years later that uh, the blinders kind of came off my eyes. I started seeing just how destructive that story was and how false it was. So what I decided to do in the book, I tell two stories, and which is it's kind of appropriate that I'm on a podcast called Stories from Real Life, because they're real life stories. And one of them is about this person that got wrapped up in this individual story, but then the second story is my own, because what it tells is the story of the blinders that were put on my eyes by virtue of growing up there, and then what happened to me gradually over the years for those blinders start to fall off, and how I became aware of that. And it was not a pleasant awakening, but it was a necessary awakening. And so what that tells me is there's hope for people to get wrapped up in those stories. That they can ultimately um, see the light, so to speak, and get out of those stories. But it's not an easy process. But so I wanted to tell the story rather than on a theoretical level. I wanted to tell it from down on the ground because that was my story, and I can relate to it both from the standpoint of a clinician, but also relate to it personally because I've been there. It's affected me.
All right, so I think you just touched on this next question, but in the book you draw a contrast between what you refer to as the reality-based community and the story-based fortress. Can you tell us
Yeah,
what you mean by those terms?
yeah. There's a um, I guess you would call him a public intellectual. He's a writer named Jonathan Rausch, who I believe he's the one that coined the term the reality-based community. And what that means is, we all have to figure out what's true and what's not. And there's such a thing called epistemology. It's how we know what we know. And one camp is what he calls the reality-based community. So what that means is that we determine what's true through testing and through evidence. You start with the information, you start with the pieces of information, you form hypotheses about what all that means, and you ultimately derive some conclusions about what's real and what's not based upon how well all that stacks up. And so, for something to make it into what he calls the constitution of knowledge, for it to make it into that body of knowledge, it has to pass all those tests. And so it's really kind of the scientific method that we start with information, we form some hypotheses, we see if the testing confirms or disconfirms our hypotheses, and if it consistently is confirmed, then we place that into the body of knowledge, what we call real, what we call reality. But even when it's placed there, there's an ongoing assumption that it could be wrong. It could be that later information will come along that will disconfirm what we believed. So there's not a sense of once it's there, we chisel it in concrete and we never change it. There's a starting point assumption that, as best we can tell, this is right. It's true and it's real. But if something comes along later that disconfirms it, we welcome the disconfirmation because then we know what belongs there and what doesn't. So that's one epistemological system, that you arrive at reality that way. Now there's an alternate system, and I don't know that I've seen anybody else use this term. This is my term, and I call it the story-based fortress. And what happens in the story-based fortress is you form a story about what you think is true, and then you go looking for information to confirm the story. And so, whereas the reality-based community starts with pieces of information and we draw our conclusions, the story-based fortress starts with a conclusion, and then you look for information that confirms the story that you want to believe. And oftentimes it's a story that people want to believe. And so they're motivated to find ways to confirm the story. And after a while, they've collected all this information. They chisel it in concrete and say, that's what's real, and you'll never convince us otherwise. And so what they're guilty of is what I call epistemic arrogance. Whereas the reality-based community is characterized by epistemic humility, the story-based fortress is more characterized by arrogance. Here's what we believe. You can't convince us otherwise. End of discussion. And stories can sound true. They can be false, but sound true. And that's what I found about my Jim Crow world is we can make all the pieces of information fit together like a Jenga tower. And we all told ourselves that story. And the story was constantly reinforced. We interpreted everything that happened in light of our previous conclusions. So at the end of the day, we went to bed with a settled assurance that our story was true, and it just couldn't be challenged. And so I never thought about that at the time, because at the time yeah, that's what was real. The old statement is a fish doesn't know it's wet. So we swam in the waters of racism, but we thought that's just the way it was. We didn't have any question about it. And it's a very immature way of looking at the world, but that really characterized the way we looked at it back then.
Yeah, I certainly didn't use the terms that you've used. But yesterday I had a situation online which was far from reality based in a lot of situations.
Yeah.
And I
Right.
called it to the person I was interacting with. I said he had a smug ignorance. And it's sort of the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
He was determined, he was convinced that he was true, but he clearly had never read any historical information that would show easily that it was not true
Right.
or was no longer true.
Yeah. Well, I like your term too, smug ignorance. But they're smug about it, but they don't know they're ignorant. And
Right.
ignorance doesn't mean they're stupid. They may be. You can have very, very bright people who have wrong conclusions, and their IQ scores are high, but they have so wrapped themselves up in this story that it all makes sense. Sometimes we refer to that as an ideological bubble. So there or information silo. So inside that silo, everything lines up, everything makes sense. There's no question about it, and anybody that doesn't believe reality that's inside that silo is either lying to you, or they've been duped by falsehood, which exists outside the fortress. So that's why it's so difficult to penetrate, because how do you argue with somebody, or how do you make a point with somebody when they are absolutely convinced that I'm right, you're wrong, end of discussion?
Yeah, I try to show grace to those people because I one of my mantras is you just don't know what you don't know, and if you've
Yeah.
never been exposed to certain things, that's true for everybody. It doesn't matter you have a
That's right.
PhD or you're a kindergartner. You don't
Yep.
you just don't know things until you're exposed to them. Okay, so let's
Yeah.
get back to your book. I really like the cleverness of the main title, Ties That Blind. Uh, what do you mean by the ties, and how do they blind us?
Well, people typically don't um, study up on a story and decide to join the story and align themselves with it. They don't get pulled in so much by ideas, they get pulled in by camaraderie. And they're looking for connections and relationships. And what the story promises is it's warm in here. Once you come in, you're going to get your relational needs met. And one of the things I make a point in the book of describing is that there are two. I mean, there's more than this, but there's two basic human needs that come into play here. One of them is attachment. We all have a need for attachment, and so we have what's called a coalitional instinct, and we want to form connections, relationships with like-minded other people. And so uh, here's a place, the story, which opens its doors to people who are willing to come in and be a part of the story. And so what it promises is we will meet your connection needs, your attachment needs. We won't say it outright, but that's sort of the underlying pull. That's what makes it so compelling. So, but what they don't realize by becoming part of that story, they have to forfeit um, their commitment to what's true. And once they become part of that story, they become blinded to reality. So it's warm, it's compelling, it kind of touches all of those zones, where you want the connections. But in order to become part of the story, you have to, on some level, be willing to give up your take on what's real and what's not to become part of the story. And it's not inside the story. Uh, it's obligatory that you have to do that. You're not free to think for yourself. You need to align your ideas and your thoughts with the story, and so people become part of it. And all this is very subtle, and so people, almost nobody knows that this is happening. It sort of happens in the shadows of their psyches, where it's operative, but they don't necessarily know that's what's occurring. So they're blinded.
Well, that was actually going to be my next question. The subtitle is "Stories
Oh,
to Keep Us in the Dark." So, can you explain what you mean by stories? You use that term a lot. Are those personal narratives, cultural myths, or sort of relational scripts?
I'd say all of the above. Um, what I talk to people on an individual level in my office who've been, a lot of times people come in to my office and they're distressed, but they don't know why they're distressed. Maybe they have some symptoms of like anxiety or depression, but they're not sure why. And so one of the things I feel like is really important to do is to unpack that a little bit. How'd you get here? What caused this mood state? And not always, but so often what I found over the years is once we start unpacking their account of how they got there, what we find is that they've been manipulated in relationships, but it's emotional manipulation and becoming part of that, what I call the drama. They become part of somebody's drama, but they don't know that. And what I have found over the years is that drama participation really takes its toll on you. And the quick way to put that is drama participation will drive you crazy. It will make you sick and it'll wear you out. I mean, it's just exhausting to be part of a drama. And um, so it really takes its toll. And I think a lot of times that's the backdrop of why somebody is depressed. So sometimes those stories operate on individual levels. And we can look at it and we can see that this person, their mood state is attributable to the ongoing up close relationship with this drama person. Now, sometimes the drama is a collective drama, and so they bought into this societal narrative, this collective narrative, and so it's had the same effect on them, but they don't really know why, and so sometimes we have to unpack that story too. But I'll tell you something else I've noticed. A lot of times when people have been deceived collectively, they don't come in necessarily for help with that. What they do come in for help with is trying to answer the question, what has happened to Uncle Fred? I mean, he used to be such a sweet natured, moral guy, and now he's part of this conspiratorial world, and he's a different person now. I mean, I dread Thanksgiving dinner because Uncle Fred's going to be there and he's going to start espousing all of this stuff that to me just sounds crazy. I just don't get what's happened here. So a lot of times those are the questions, that people bring into my office when the story has been a collectively deceptive story.
Wow. So, what are some of the mechanisms that sort of tie us to these deceptions?
Well, I think, like I was saying a few minutes ago, I think people get pulled into these stories because they want the connections, and here's a place inside the story that offers the warm embrace of crowd inclusion. And it's Saturday, so right now, so we go to football games, and there's something thrilling about watching a football game in a stadium versus watching it on TV because you're sitting in the crowd and you're doing the wave and everybody's screaming at the same time. And so there's something really exhilarating about, in fact, Emile Durkheim, a French philosopher, called that collective effervescence. So there's just something about being part of that, that crowd that crowd thrill that is appealing to people. And so it's not just me. These are not just my ideas alone, but I'm part of a collective process that is just attractive and it pulls me in. But the other thing that happens once you become part of it, it starts to um, distort your take on reality because now you have to um, shape shift what you believe to match the collective beliefs. And what I say in the book is the theme of the book is when we embrace stories that distort reality and disintegrate the self. When I say disintegrate, what I mean is disintegrate. You have to split yourself apart in order to become part of the collective. So you have to become some lesser version of yourself to become part of this collective arrangement. Now, nobody spells that out. Nobody knows that's what's happening. But the longer people stay in these collectives, you find it starts to diminish who they are as individuals. They've had to forfeit individual identity for the collective identity of the group. And if part of the collective identity of the group involves immoral actions, then it will take this previously very moral person and they'll lay those moralities aside and participate in collective immoralities. And I mean, I've got a million examples of that from my own growing up years in Jim Crow, Mississippi. People, lovely, wonderful people, who went to church on Sundays, but what they advocated in their day-to-day lives was racial discrimination, racial oppression, white supremacy, but they never saw the connection. They didn't see the latter being uh, a reflection of the former, and they just didn't make that connection. So to them, it was all just healthy and normal. I didn't see it then, but later I started to see it, and it was shocking to see.
All right, that makes me think of two questions. I'll ask them separately here rather than trying to combine them. What role does self awareness play in beginning to unravel these stories?
That's a really good story. I mean, a really good question. Um, we all have part of ourselves that is able to step outside of ourselves and make big picture self observations. And sometimes in my field, this is sort of a technical term, you call that the observing ego. And so it is your ability to self observe, self monitor, and self correct. So it's the dot connecting part of yourself. And the illustration I use with the students in the class that I teach is it's like the observing ego is like a press box on a football field. And again, we're in football season. So if you've ever noticed a football player, a quarterback, when he comes off the field, one of the first things he usually does is he takes off his helmet and he puts on a headset. Well, who's he talking to? Well, he's talking to some of the coaches on the sidelines, but usually he's talking to the guys up in the press box who can say from up there, we can tell you why you just got smeared for that 22-yard loss. Here's the correction you need to make. Or they can say, game plan is working perfectly, don't change a thing. The quarterback takes that input from up top, puts his helmet back on, goes back out onto the field where all he can do is see horizontally, but he's better off because he just had that big picture conversation. That's like an observing ego. So there are some people that have really well developed observing egos. And so it's harder for them to get sucked into these arrangements because they can see themselves and they see what they're doing and they go, wait a minute, I've got to think about this again. That's not right. But there are other people that seem to have very deficient self-observational abilities. They don't see it. They just don't see it. So they're easier prey to get sucked into it. So I think self-awareness is it's a necessary ingredient for a healthy personality, but the lack of it is one of those qualities that makes somebody particularly vulnerable to being deceived.
Okay, so the second part of my observation for the previous answer was your own self reflection. When you started to peel away these layers in your own life and seeing what you were a part of in your community, how, what was the sort of aha moment for you, and what was the response from those closest to you?
Um, another couple of really good questions. I would say, and I talk about this in the book. I mean, in the telling of my story, part of my story was how the blinders on my eyes started to be unraveled, and just about every element of that had to do with relationships with others. It didn't just happen because I read a book and decided it was wrong, but it was usually through my relational experiences that it started to have an eye-opening effect on me. And um, one of the factors, this wasn't the only one, but I think being in my field, being a psychologist, one of the things I came to see as an important ingredient for somebody's emotional well-being is self-awareness. And when somebody is not self-aware, um, they don't function so well. They may think they function well, but they don't know they're not functioning well because they have no self-awareness. But other people know it. And I don't know if you ever watched the old show The Office. Michael
I've
Scott
seen a
on The
couple of
Office was,
episodes. Yeah.
yeah, well, he's a quintessential narcissist. And one of the running sub themes in that show is that other people saw what he was like and he was completely oblivious to it. So a lot of the show was kind of centered around that. That was one of the themes of the show. So I think just there were certain people that I was around and certain relational situations that I couldn't make certain things line up with the story I'd always been told. I mean, just one of the first things that happened to me in high school, I started working. So I had a job where many of my coworkers were African Americans. I had always been taught inside my story that African Americans had deficient intellectual abilities. There were certain other negatives, and that was just all part of the story. And being around these people, it didn't square up with the story. And what it did for me is it left me with this um, incongruence, this dissonance. You call that cognitive dissonance. I believed in white superiority, and yet I was around people who weren't the slightest bit inferior. And that created a dissonance in me, and I couldn't make that line up. So I had to start to make some mental shift to say, there's something wrong with the story I was being told because it doesn't line up with the reality that I'm seeing happen before my very eyes. And so as time went on, there were just more and more of those kind of things that the reality challenged the story. And I had to start to realize that what I had always believed just didn't line up, and I couldn't make that square up. And you said, was there an aha moment? I don't think there was an aha moment, but I think there was a series of smaller aha moments that started to coalesce into a larger, growing awareness that the story I'd always believed was false. I just had always thought it was true.
Well, I typically don't ask follow up questions in this format, but this is so intriguing and in some ways personal. So I have to ask a couple of follow ups here
Yeah,
from
that's fine.
my own observations. I think it's interesting how you were willing to shift your story to adjust to the new information you had been exposed to. Whereas I see a lot of people who are more willing to keep the story and carve out exceptions.
Yeah.
So the people would have worked with would have been different. They would have been an exception. They wouldn't have been a challenge to what you thought was a fact.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why I say one. It wasn't one aha moment. It was just we're talking. This took place over decades, and so There wasn't an afternoon where suddenly all the lights came on for me, but I think there was just a series of events over time that I found myself becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the story I was being told. And I think that's another feature of emotional health and well-being, is to have a bad feeling about bad things. Uh, and and some of the feelings I had were uncomfortable feelings, but that was a good thing that I felt uncomfortable about it, because by being uncomfortable about it, it motivated me to try to change my perspectives. And there's a saying that's been attributed to James A. Garfield, our 20th president. In fact, I like it so much it hangs on my office wall. But he said, the truth will set you free, but first it will make you miserable. And I love that statement. And
Yes,
I
I like
show it to
that.
clients sometimes, or sometimes I walk in my office and see it and point at it and go, yeah, that's so right. Because the truth is liberating, but when it challenges what you've always previous believed, it's kind of miserable, at first to recognize that. But the misery is a good thing. The bad feeling serves a good purpose. If you allow that to start to shift away from a false story to actual reality.
Okay, so you've written before about difficult relationships. How does Ties That Blind relate to or differ from your earlier books, like How to Solve Your People Problems?
Yeah. Um, the first book that I wrote, there's a couple of motivations in writing the book. I saw over the course of my career, I've seen a lot of couples and who come in wanting to work things out, but they don't know how to work things out. And in some cases, it's an information deficit. They genuinely want to resolve their conflict problems, but they are at a loss for how to do that. I had a lady come in one time. She was a physician, and her husband was an educator. And toward the end of the first intake session, I said, "What are you guys hoping that this does for you to come see me?" And like that, she said, uh, "I want to work things out." And he agreed. And I said, "Well, that's great. That's a worthy objective. But let me ask you something. What does working things out mean?" And just as quickly, she said, "I have no idea." And here she was, a physician. It wasn't a very bright person, and so was he. But they were really clueless at knowing how to resolve things. And so that's not an unusual answer. People really know it. They know it. They know they should, but they don't know how to do it. So part of the reason I wrote the first book was to try to spell that out. And I found myself saying those things so often over the years that after a while I thought, one of these days I ought to write this stuff down, and just for time saving purposes. And I originally thought, well, I'll take it to Kinko's and have them run it off, and I could charge people for what it cost me to copy it. But after a while, to my surprise, it did get published. So part of the book is how do you resolve conflict problems? And there are some people that have the equipment, the internal psychological equipment to do it. They just don't know how to do it. So there's an information deficit. And I call them reasonable people because they are reason able. They have the ability and willingness to resolve things. They just need to learn how to do it and practice what they know. But the other part of that book had to do, but we have to address another topic. What about those people who you have in your life who you have problems with, but they don't have reason abilities? And we call them unreasonable or unreasonable. They have neither the ability nor willingness to resolve things. They just want to be right. What do you do with those people? So you can't use normal conflict resolution methods with those people because they don't have the prerequisite qualities to engage in problem solving. And so but they still want to be in relationships just like everybody else. So what they engage in instead of problem solving is drama. Now, the way the drama works is my role in our relationship is this, your role in this relationship is that. As long as we both stay inside of our drama roles, we'll have a great relationship. So relational success is contingent upon drama participation. That's just how it works. And there's various types of drama. And in one type of drama, I'm in charge. Your job is to acquiesce to my control. As long as you do what your role in the drama, we'll have a great relationship. Another type of drama is I need to be taken care of. Your job in our relationship is to take care of me. As long as we both stay in our roles, we'll have a great relationship. So there's various types of drama. So the first book was all about that. And what I wanted to do for people that were more interested in the latter part of the book, The Unreasonable People, is how do you become a drama non-participant? All the obligations are to stay in the drama, and you pay a price if you don't. So how do you extricate yourself from dramas that you found yourself wrapped up in? So that first book was really about how that happens to people on an individual level. And with that as the backdrop, as the years went by, I started realizing, well, there is a collective version of that. There's such a thing as a collective drama. And particularly where you have somebody who's a demagogue or an authoritarian or a strongman. So my job is to be in control. Your job is to do what I need you to do. And as long as you do that, we'll all get along swimmingly. But it just doesn't work that way, as we know. So my interest shifted over time from how that happens individually to how that happens collectively. So that's really more the subject matter of the second book. But here's my contention. People ask questions. How does that happen to people? How can masses of people fall prey to conspiracy theories? Or how can masses of people lay aside their individual moral commitments and adopt the collective immoralities of a group? So if you can understand how that happens on an individual level, you're better equipped to understand how it happens on a collective level. So that's why I tried to combine both things in this first book. Is the first story is how it happens individually. The second story is how it happens collectively. If you can understand the former, you're better equipped to understand the latter.
Well, I had an episode recently with a history professor, and we talked about revivalism, conspiracies, and celebrity culture. So it would be a great conversation if I had both of you on here together to talk about those things from your different fields of your expertise fields. That would be, I
Yeah,
think that'd be really, really compelling.
lots of overlap there. Yeah, yeah.
Yes. So, what role does forgiveness play in this process, whether it's forgiving others or forgiving ourselves?
Well, it's a very good question. I get asked that all the time, and I'll tell you what. Um, here's what happens. Sometimes people feel like I'm so. Um, when I think about with my eyes being open and how this person has manipulated me, when I think about it, I get mad. But if I'm mad about it, it shows that I haven't forgiven them. So I need to maybe get on my knees and pray real hard for forgiveness. And maybe once I get forgiveness, I won't feel bad toward them anymore. And what I try to do is to disabuse people of that notion. I don't think that's accurate. You can forgive someone and still not trust them. And if the person is not acting in a way that's worthy of your trust, it would be foolish on your part to trust someone who's not trustworthy. But not trusting them is not synonymous with lack of forgiveness. So, we can do two contradictory things at one time. And I think this is one of those places where we kind of have to be able to hold that tension and to say, I'm not going to let this person dominate all of the landscape in my brain. I'm not going to rehearse all of their grievance, all of the things that they did to me. I'm not going to let that be central to my existence. I want to be able to forgive and move on. Now, they haven't changed a bit, so I'm not going to trust them any further than I can throw them. And so to be able to forgive someone and still not trust them, I think is a mark of maturity to be able to do that if they've never changed their ways. It's another thing if they've changed their ways. If they've said, I've really seen the light in ways that I think probably wouldn't have except through my relationship with you. So I'm willing to change. That's one thing. And then you can start to build back some trust.
All right. So if you could speak just one truth to readers of Ties That Blind that you hope they carry forward, what would that one thing be?
Um, yeah, I use a statement in the book a couple of times. I think I wrote it down here. I want to read it to you. It says, some some people get lost in a cave, only illumined by a sliver of light seeping into the darkness, and then wander further into the cave where there is no light. Others follow the sliver and get more and more light as they get closer to the cave's entrance. So, um, I guess if there's one thing I'd want to get across to people is pay attention to the slivers of light. Follow that sliver. Don't disregard it. Don't cover your eyes when you see something that creates some dissonance for you. Don't disregard it. That discomfort you're feeling may be something that is telling you something really important. So go with it, follow it. You don't necessarily know what it is, just don't disregard it. Uh, you know, keep yourself in the truth-seeking mode. And I just, I don't think we can. Um, it may make you miserable, like James A. Garfield said. If you seek truth, it may make you miserable, but following the truth always has an ultimate payoff. There's always something to be gained by aligning yourself with what's true and be willing to challenge the falseness of the story that you've always believed, even if it's uncomfortable. And I guess the other thing I would say is be willing to act courageously. Now, sometimes courage is not, it's counterintuitive. What's most intuitive is to act cowardly. And you may have some short-term gain from acting cowardly, but there's a long-term detrimental effect. Courage may cost you in the short term, but there's so much long-term gain from that. So what I try to get across to people is courage and cowardice are contagious, and we should be careful which we display. And so it's people always are inspired by someone who acts courageously. People who act cowardly, we tend to forget who they are. So be willing to be a person of courage. I guess I'm preaching this to myself. Uh, I try to preach that to myself on a daily basis. I don't claim to be the paragon of courage. It's something I aspire to more than I display, but I want to keep aspiring to it.
Yeah, courage is definitely one of the traits that I admire the most in the people I consider heroes.
Yeah.
So, are the stories that you talk about in your book, are they universal? Are they sort of uniquely American stories?
Uh, Good question. I think they're universal. I mean, um, and some of the stories that I make reference to in the book are not Americans. I mean, these are people. I mean, some of them were from Nazi Germany. They come from different parts of the world in different eras. I think there's some universal principles. Um, I'm not sure there's anything that any of what I talk about, I don't think is culturally bound. I think we find applications of the principles regardless of culture. I'm sure there are some features of American life that make people more prone to buy into false stories that operate here that maybe don't operate in other places. But I think they would have their applications of the same mistakes that they make in other cultures too. So I don't think they're culturally bound stories. My story about being wrapped up in Jim Crow, Mississippi, that was a specific reference to the 1950s, 60s, and 70s United States. But as we know, those stories were going on all over the planet. We just had our own version of it.
All right. So how do you navigate the tension between accepting the past, especially your own history, and being liberated from it?
Um, I think we get liberated from the past by accepting all parts of the past. And I think there's such a, again, I grew up in the lost cause, the lost cause philosophy, mythology,
With the Civil
and
War.
the Civil War. And so, after the Civil War, when the South was defeated, they just rewrote the story in the latter part of the 1800s to say, we didn't actually lose. We were just defeated, but we actually won, and here's why. So they maintained the system of white supremacy and just revised the history. It was a revision, and I would make the case that they were enslaved to the revision. I mean, there was a whole effort to rewrite all of the textbooks, uh, and it was just chock full of lost cause mythology. Those were the textbooks that I studied from when I was a kid. They were still around in the 50s and 60s. So um, as time has gone on, and I've started to read things that weren't of that genre and understand the actual history as opposed to the revised history, it has liberated me in ways I never thought possible. Um, I use this analogy that I felt like I had grown up in a house and there was a door that I never opened to that house. And then once I started reading all the history that I'd never been taught, it's like I opened that door and there were several wings to that house that I never knew were there. That it really opened my eyes and it liberated me. So um, I, sometimes what people who want to go back and reinforce the old revisionist history will call what we're currently doing is revisionist history. And it's not revisionist history. We're revising history that was long ago revised. And we can't, it actually unshackles us from the dictates of that old story. So it's very, very liberating to people. So again, I go back to that statement: the truth will set you free.
Yeah, I try to limit the amount of politics that I have on my show, but I can't ignore the current situations with the president and administration of trying to what you called what they think is revising the revision of the
Yeah.
Civil War by
Mhm.
replacing the statues that were removed, reinstituting the names of Confederate generals on military bases. Because
Yeah.
I guess I come to this conclusion that that's the era they think was the great era that they want to
Yeah.
return to make America great again. There has to have been
Yeah.
a certain part that they thought was the great part that they want to return to. That seems like a reasonable conclusion to me when I
Yeah.
see those kinds of things.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I thoroughly agree with you on that. And it's not eliminating revisionist history. It's reinstituting a revision because it's the story they want to believe. And that's the thing about a story is it doesn't have to be true. It just needs to be explanatory. And this is the explanation they want to believe, they want to hold on to, so they double down on the story and call anybody that doesn't believe the revision a liar or supporting deception. And so that in and of itself is the deception.
Yes, I agree. And one more thing about that, and then we'll move on because we just have a couple questions left. I worked at the Texas Capitol for 5 years for different elected officials, including the governor. And there's on the southernmost point of the Texas Capitol grounds, there's a monument for Confederate soldiers. And there's a plaque on that monument that if you read that plaque and you didn't understand history, you would think, of course, these Confederate soldiers were the good guys. They were the heroes.
Yeah.
From reading just one single paragraph, and that's the narrative that so many people grew up with, as you mentioned, and it seems to be difficult for those people to let go of that story.
It's convenient to keep believing the story, and it's most settling to continue to believe what you've always believed, because everything fits into neat little boxes. And in the way I describe it, sometimes it's like a Jenga tower. It all fits in. It all fits together in such a satisfactory way. It doesn't leave any loose ends, and there's no ugliness in the story. So we just rewrite the story and make it what we want it to be.
Okay, your book ultimately strikes a hopeful tone. So why did you choose to end it that way?
Well, I think people are prone to one of two errors. One is to say, it's not that bad. Let's just keep on going. Everything will turn around. You'll see. And so it's very much of a Pollyanna kind of view. I think it's irrational exuberance. It's this way of just saying everything's going to turn out just fine. That's one error. I think the other error that people can make is, well, that's it. We're done. There's nothing that can be done. So I'm just going to stop paying attention and let me focus on the things in my life that give me some peace and joy. And I don't bother me with all that stuff that's going on. And ironically, the first group does the same thing. Everything's fine. I'm not going to pay attention. The second group says everything's horrible. I'm not going to pay attention. Well, when nobody's paying attention, that's exactly what authoritarians want, is nobody paying attention. Then they have a free hand to do whatever they want to do. So neither one of those, I think, is a truly hopeful position. I think it's more hopeful to say we may not be able to accomplish everything we'd like to accomplish right now, but that doesn't mean we're going to stop trying. One of the things that it's been there for a long time, but I'm late to the game in seeing it. And that is, to me, one of the greatest examples of hopefulness that we've had that's been around for a long time is the black church. Because they had this long history of first of slavery and then Jim Crow. And yet they continue to have hope in the midst of circumstances that would suggest there is no hope. And so what they had to come to terms with is a concept called delayed justice. And what that means is justice is coming, but we don't know when it's going to be, but we're willing to wait it out. And so they never lost hope in the midst of that delay. And kind of in the midst of all of this, my eyes becoming open to all this stuff, we ended up shifting churches to one in the Nashville area that's a multi-ethnic church, and all of the staff members of the church, the leadership of the church, are all people of color. And one of the things that my African American pastor says, I love this. He said, "It's not just it's not just pie in the sky when we die. It's steak on the plate while we wait." And I love that statement, because we don't just say, okay, nothing can be done. One day we'll die and be in heaven. But it's more to say, while that's true, there's a lot that can be done in the meantime. So let's work while we can. Be willing to come to terms with delayed justice and be courageous about it. And again, courage is contagious. And so when people see that, they're more prone to act courageously themselves. So there's a lot that could be done in the meantime. So I didn't end the book with some rosy picture of everything's going to be fine, but more to say, a lot to be done, but let's act courageously in the meantime.
Okay, a final question that I ask all of my guests. What's one piece of advice you'd like to leave today on any subject related to today's topic or otherwise?
Well, um, apart from buying my book, uh, I would go back to the two things I said earlier is uh, be a light follower. Don't disregard the light. And then the other part of that, I guess the flip side of that coin would be um, don't write people off that you feel like have been um, so thoroughly ensconced in the story that you can't relate to them anymore. You may not be able to ever reason them out of the conclusions they've drawn. I mean, the saying is you can't reason somebody out of a conclusion they didn't reach by reason. So reasoning them out probably won't work, but you can have a relationship with them. And that relationship you have with them might serve as the very sliver of life that they've started disregarding. Because if you are somebody that is not um, they portray you to be, and they can't make that square up, hopefully that will create some dissonance, and that might be a sliver of light. So be the sliver of light, follow the slivers, but also be the slivers for other people. So I guess that's the way I would sum it up.
Okay, that's a good way to end this episode today. So our guest has been psychologist and author Dr. Alan Godwin. Alan, thank you so much for being here. It's been a joy to have you here, and I had to really restrain myself from asking more questions because this is such a fascinating topic for me.
Yeah, it's totally my pleasure, and I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you. So please go to my website at podcastreallife.com for more information about my guest and the things we discussed today, including a link to his new book, The Ties That Blind. That's it for today's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another chance to learn from each other. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.